Have you ever been booking a trip, booking those flights, looking up local attractions, and then suddenly, for some reason, your browser starts showing you prices that were higher than they were a minute ago? Well, that's based on your location and your IP. Also, sometimes you just find you don't get access to websites at all because of where you are. It's frustrating, we know, and that's where Surfshark comes in. Surfshark VPN masks your online activities, keeping your data private and secure. Whether you're chilling out at a cafe or exploring a new city, Surfshark ensures your online presence is safe from prying eyes. With just one tap on the Surfshark app, you can connect to a server halfway around the world. That means you can access your favorite shows on Netflix no matter where you are. It's super easy to use. You just open the app, you choose the country, and you're connected. Easy. Plus, Surfshark doesn't break the bank. One subscription covers all of your devices. Ready to surf the web safely and freely? Go to surfshark.deals/ITS and use the promo code ITS for 4 months extra on your subscription. Don't let your location mess up your plans. With Surfshark, you're always a click away from home comforts and online freedom. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring, and now back to today's video. Wednesday, April 18th, 1906 was supposed to be a day like any other. Instead, it became a day the people of San Francisco would never forget. At 5:12 a.m. that morning, the San Andreas Fault, snaking its way through the length of the state of California, slipped. Instead of slowly grinding past each other at a pace of 2 inches a year, the two tectonic plates violently lurched 15 feet past each other. The resulting earthquake and the fire that hit the city of San Francisco is still considered one of the worst natural disasters in US history. At the time, there was no way to measure the intensity of the earthquake, but most scientists estimate it to have been between a 7.7 and a 7.9 on the Richter scale, though some estimates place it as high as 8.3. The earthquake was felt from Coos Bay, Oregon, to Los Angeles and central Nevada. While San Francisco experienced the worst of it, the rest of the state was not spared. The earthquake's destructive effect extended from the southern part of Fresno County to Eureka, a distance of around 400 miles, and at a distance of 20 to 30 miles on either side of the fault. Looking back, there was some warning that a disaster was on the way. 16 small earthquakes were recorded in 1905 alone. However, research into earthquakes was just beginning, and those living in San Francisco didn't realize that they were headed for a disaster that would level the city. In 1906, San Francisco was the largest city on the Pacific coast and the 9th largest city in the United States, an industrial city with the most important port. It was also the financial center of the West, with 42 banks. The US Mint at 5th and Mission Streets was the largest in the world, containing 1/3 of the country's gold, worth $222 million. City Hall was the largest public building west of Chicago, and the Emporium on Market Street was the biggest department store in the West. The city was thriving and growing rapidly. Established during the gold rush of 1849, the Instant City wasn't even a century old yet. It was only celebrating its 57th year. After the gold rush, the 1870s saw more money pouring into the city, courtesy of the Nevada silver mines, and railroad barons and other industry giants built 50-room mansions on Nob Hill, displaying their wealth and importance for all to see. It was a city of contrasts, both the Paris of America and the wickedest city on the continent. For those in San Francisco, fine dining in some of the classiest restaurants was followed by performances in one of the many grand theaters or opera houses. The night before the disaster, Enrique Caruso, one of the most famous tenors of all time, was performing the role of Don Jose in Bizet's Carmen at the Grand Opera House. The events that followed left him so traumatized that he swore never to return to San Francisco. The city had 120 places of worship, along with over 3,000 establishments where spirits of a different kind could be enjoyed. Prostitution and drugs weren't hard to find, and some of the dance halls never closed. Vice and civic corruption went hand in hand. One bordello in particular had such a good understanding and close relationship with the city politicians that it was known as the municipal brothel. From its very early beginnings, the city of San Francisco was a fire hazard, with wooden houses crowded closely together. The fire chief, Dennis Sullivan, repeatedly asked for more money to build a high-pressure water system that could use both fresh water from alternative sources and salt water from the bay for firefighting. The city was built in a region known for earthquakes. 3 big earthquakes were documented in 1836, 1868, and 1892, and the fire chief realized that it was only a matter of time before an earthquake disrupted the existing water system, leaving the city vulnerable to fire. Unfortunately, though, nobody listened. Wednesday morning dawned, but unlike all the other Wednesdays that came before, all around the city, people woke from their sleep to the sounds of breaking china and shattering glass. The first shock hit at 5:12 a.m., with a second, more intense shock arriving around 20 seconds later. While the main shock only lasted between 45 and 60 seconds, to those trapped in a city shaking itself apart, it must have felt like an eternity. Thomas Jefferson Chase, a ticket clerk and telegrapher employed at the ferry building, was walking to work in the brisk early morning, giving him a front row seat to the earthquake, which he later described in one of many eyewitness accounts of the disaster. I had reached about halfway to Howard on the west side of First Street when I heard a low and distant rumble. It was coming from the west, louder and louder. I stopped and listened. Then it hit. Power and trolley lines snapped like threads. The ends of the power lines dropped to the pavement, not 10 feet from where I stood, writhing and hissing like reptiles. Brick and glass showered about me. Buildings along First Street from Howard to Market crumbled like cart houses. One was brick. Not a soul escaped. The dust hung low over the rubble in the street. As this shock stopped, I crossed over to the east side of the street. As soon as I reached the curb, a second shock hit. This was harder than the first. I was thrown flat, and the cobblestones danced like corn in a popper. More brick and glass showered down on the sidewalk. If I had been a block or two further down on First Street, I would not be here today. I started down Howard for the ferry. On Howard Street was a row of framed cheap apartments. The outside wall of one building was in the street, exposing the rooms like a dollhouse. A few people were in the street, in their nightclothes and barefoot, crying, moaning, and wringing their hands. Looking down First Street, through the dust of demolished buildings, a wisp of black smoke was rising through the dust. The black smoke was the beginning of a fire that would rage for 3 days. The great earthquake that hit sleeping San Francisco that morning ruptured gas lines, overturned lamps, lanterns, and stoves, and snapped electric cables, causing sparks that ignited fires all over the city. Soon after the world stopped shaking, 53 fires were already ablaze in various parts of the city. Unfortunately, the earthquake also burst the water mains, leaving the burning city without water to fight the fires. Fire Chief Engineer Dennis Sullivan was mortally wounded in the initial earthquake when the dome of the California Theater crashed through the fire station where he was living at the time. Acting Chief Engineer John Dougherty soon took over, but the early loss in leadership at such a critical moment hampered rescue efforts. Initially, the various fires had names: the Chinese Laundry Fire, the San Francisco Gas and Electric Fire, the Hayes Valley Fire, the Ham and Eggs Fire. The Hayes Valley Fire. The Ham and Eggs Fire was started when a survivor tried to cook breakfast for her family, not realizing that the chimney had been damaged in the earthquake. The sparks that ignited the kitchen started a fire that ended up destroying a part of the Mechanics Pavilion and City Hall. The South of Market Fire was initially contained by fireboats pumping water from the bay, but soon spread north and west. By noon, multiple small fires had come together to make one large fire, and a wall of flame 1.5 miles long devoured the dry wooden houses, leaving destruction in its wake. The fire swept from the business section near Montgomery Street and the south of Market District towards Russian Hill, North Beach, and Telegraph Hill, and would eventually burn through the city's downtown, Chinatown, and Nob Hill. The city was thrown into complete turmoil. Thousands of people were in the streets, many of whom had lost everything in a matter of seconds. They were frightened, without food or water, and with the communication lines in and out of the city destroyed, San Francisco had no way to call for help. Stunned and dazed crowds arrived at the ferry building, black and dirty, with a wild look in their eyes, carrying bundles and suitcases, having saved what they could from their homes, destroyed by an earthquake and now on fire. The ferry building miraculously survived the blaze, but the street outside was like looking into the door of a furnace, flames rolling down the street with a roar. What little water could be found did no good. The water simply went up in steam, and firefighters couldn't get near the blaze. Some observers claimed that the fire could actually be felt as vibrations like the rumbling of a steam boiler or the passing of several streetcars. By midday, the ferry building was completely cut off from the rest of the city. Thousands of people had already fled via the ferries, and finally the ferry building was abandoned, and the last of the ferries left the wharf for the safety of San Francisco Bay. Similar stories came from all parts of the cities. Survivors described the earth rolling like waves out at sea, some as high as 3 feet. Buildings shook and fell down, the ground split and streets cracked, the widest crack measuring 28 feet wide, with water spouting up like fountains as water mains ruptured. Horses bolted and dogs ran down the street. A hotel collapsed, killing 103 of the 106 people inside. An unknown man was pinned to the ground by another collapsing building. Attempts to rescue him failed, and with the fire fast approaching, he begged to be killed before burning to death. One man stepped forward and shot him. Afterwards, the shooter and some witnesses arrived at the Hall of Justice. The man wanted to turn himself into the police, but upon hearing the story, he was commended for his humane act and sent on his way. The morgue was soon overflowing with bodies, so the target range at the Central Police Station was turned into an emergency morgue. However, identifying the dead was a near impossible task, as many were unrecognizable as the heat of the fire had turned many bodies to ash. By 5 p.m. on the day of the earthquake, more than 50 bodies had to be buried in Portsmouth Square, as the morgue and police pistol range couldn't hold any more bodies. As is often the case with disasters, it didn't take long for looters and thieves to start making use of the opportunity. Police and soldiers were patrolling the streets, but they were preoccupied with saving the city and its people. With the jails rendered unsafe, even if a police officer or soldier could spare a moment to arrest anyone, they had nowhere to take the criminals. This led the mayor of San Francisco, Mayor E.E. Schmitz, to issue a chilling proclamation. The federal troops, the members of the regular police force, and special police officers have been authorized by me to kill any and all persons found to be engaged in looting or in the commission of any other crime. The order to kill the looters was meant to control mobs and authorize the U.S. Army to use deadly force if necessary to maintain law and order. However, the mayor wasn't actually authorized to permit the army to shoot civilians. According to some witness accounts, the poor and minorities were preferentially targeted by the order, whereas the more affluent that got caught looting were only given severe warnings. In one instance, a woman claimed to have seen a soldier stab a man who came out of a grocery store with his arms full of groceries. The proprietor of the store, seeing the fire coming and realizing the store would be lost, had opened the doors, encouraging people to take what they needed before it was all lost to the flames. The number of looters, and presumed looters, shot due to the mayor's order differs wildly, from 9 to a dozen to 100. The streets of San Francisco had become the Wild West. When the earthquake hit, the US military immediately stepped up and took control of the situation without waiting for orders from all the way in Washington, D.C. The military had the people with the necessary training and skills, the supplies, and a functioning transportation and communications network, all things vital in the first hours of a disaster. Within minutes of the earthquake, US military personnel were on the streets of San Francisco to lend aid, many on their own initiative. Nothing pulls people together like a disaster, and for once, interdepartmental rivalries and bureaucracy were set aside. It was agreed that the question of who actually held the authority in which operations would be settled after the first emergency operations were completed. The USS Independence loaned its fire hoses and all its stretchers to the mayor of Vallejo. The Navy turned over all its medical supplies to the Army without the normal paperwork. City firemen and police officers were working tirelessly side by side with soldiers, sailors, and Marines of all ranks to save those trapped in demolished and burning buildings. Brigadier General Frederick Funston, commander of Fort Mason, in the absence of Major General Adolphus Greeley, who happened to be out of town, never declared martial law. But being the highest-ranking officer on hand, the army was initially in charge. However, Funston made it very clear to his forces that they were to follow the orders of the civilian authorities. Within 2 hours of the earthquake, most of the troops stationed at Fort Mason and the Presidio, an active army outpost at the time, had reported to the mayor's temporary office at the Hall of Justice since City Hall had been leveled by the earthquake, and by 11:30 a.m., more troops arrived from Fort Miley. The US Mint in San Francisco suffered relatively little damage compared to most other buildings thanks to its strong foundation, but most banks were destroyed or shut down, and military forces were needed to guard bank vaults from both the elements and looters. At 10:30 a.m., the USS Preble from Mare Island, under Lieutenant Frederick Newton Freeman, landed a hospital shore party at the foot of Howard Street to assist the wounded at the Harbor Emergency Hospital. The city's hospitals were badly damaged, so the Presidio's Army Hospital and Army Field Hospital were set up to treat civilians. An emergency hospital was also set up in the Mechanics Pavilion, a large wooden structure ordinarily used for exhibitions and prize fights just off of Union Square. However, when the pavilion also caught fire, the living patients were evacuated, with staff commandeering anything with wheels to move the patients, while the dead were left to be cremated as the building burned down around them. 250,000 people were suddenly on the streets, some with little more than the clothes on their back, shocked and destitute. Funston's first priority was getting drinking water to a city in turmoil. The Navy brought in drinking water and milk on ships, while engineers worked to get a backup water system up and running. Fearing famine, the contents of the grocery stores were seized and distributed to survivors in the coming days until emergency supplies started arriving by train. The first day also saw both Navy and Army leaders ordering blankets, tents, and food as they helplessly watched the city and military warehouses burn to the ground. Within 2 days, portable latrines and every tent owned by the Army were en route to San Francisco, and supplies intended for other naval stations were confiscated and rerouted to the city on the bay. Water was pumped from the bay for fires near the waterfront. It saved the ferry buildings, but couldn't do anything to prevent the fires from spreading. With the water mains ruptured, the fire engines were all but useless until the Sotoyomo, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Robert F. Lopez, started bringing in water in an attempt to save the city. The Sotoyomo traveled back and forth between the Goat Island Torpedo Station, now Yerba Buena Island, to bring over 5,000 gallons of fresh water to San Francisco. 200 gallons were set aside as drinking water for the refugees, while the rest was used to fill up fire engines working to fight the fires, but with little success. The fire was simply raging out of control. The only solution seemed to be dynamite. During the first few days of the fire, city authorities refused to permit the military to dynamite any buildings that weren't on fire already. However, by the second evening, it became clear that drastic measures were needed, and Funston met with the Citizens Committee to outline a plan to stop the fire using dynamite to blow up some city blocks to create a firebreak and stop the spreading flames. It was a risky plan, but options were running out. So the committee finally gave permission, and after evacuating the condemned city blocks, the dangerous job began. The charges often had to be laid in buildings already on fire, and dynamite had to be carried by hand through showers of sparks. On the evening of April 19th, the army began preparations to create a firebreak at an east-west division of the city along Van Ness Avenue, a stretch of road boasting some of the most affluent mansions in the city. The members of the committee watched in silence as 3 blocks of expensive mansions were demolished every 20 minutes. There's some debate as to how effective this operation was in the end. Those doing the dynamiting weren't that experienced with explosives, and sometimes failed to check the direction of the wind or to anticipate the direction the fire would go before blasting. In some cases, instead of creating a firebreak, flaming debris was sent to neighboring blocks, which only managed to spread the fire faster and further. Meanwhile, the Navy stepped in to rescue refugees that found themselves on the waterfront, trapped between the flames and the bay. The USS Marion, under control of the California Naval Militia, rescued over 2,000 people at the dock on Folsom Street and moved them away from the danger to a safe distance, and the USS Chicago supervised the rescue of 20,000 refugees at the foot of Van Ness Avenue. It was the largest evacuation by sea at the time. With telephone and telegraph lines down, all communication had to go via the wireless system on board the USS Chicago to the outside world. The U.S. Army Signal Corps stepped in to restore communications, and by all accounts did a spectacular job. By 10 a.m. on the day of the earthquake, a military telegraph from the Presidio to the military headquarters at Hayth and Market Streets was up and running. Western Union was able to reopen some of their offices by April 20th, 2 days after the disaster, and by mid-May, communications in and to San Francisco had been restored to normal. After the first few days, once the immediate threat and the needs of those affected by the disaster were dealt with, cooperation between the various military branches, the city officials and state officials, went downhill. There were accusations of looting and complaints about who was in charge of what. Luckily, by then, the worst of the disaster had passed. Along with his controversial order to shoot all looters, the mayor of San Francisco also directed all the gas and electric companies not to turn on gas or electricity until being given permission to do so by the authorities. Broken and leaking gas pipes, broken fixtures, and damaged or destroyed chimneys could lead to more fires, which the city was simply not equipped to deal with. In order to prevent violence in the streets, a dusk to dawn curfew was instated and all saloons were closed. Any establishment ignoring this order had every drop of alcohol on the premises poured down the sewer. With no light and nowhere else to go, those lucky enough to still have a home spent the first nights after the earthquake sitting in darkness. As with the looting order, those enforcing the dusk to dawn curfew sometimes took it to an extreme. One eyewitness claimed that a young man was shot dead at around 5 in the morning for leaving his home to borrow some whiskey for his sick mother. He was ordered to throw it away by a soldier, and when he refused, he was shot. This was just one of many similar cases. However, those who had homes to go back to were the lucky few. More than half of San Francisco's population of 400,000 were homeless, and many were too afraid to sleep in their damaged homes, worried that they might be buried under the rubble if another earthquake hit. Around 100,000 people who lost their homes and had no friends or family to take them in camped in public parks and graveyards, sleeping out in the open or under whatever shelter they could find. No fires were allowed, but it wasn't really needed. On the night of the 18th, the bonfire that was the city of San Francisco lit up the night sky. One survivor remarked that it was light enough to read a book. People evacuating their homes was a curious sight, using anything with wheels to transport what they could save, including toy wagons, wheelbarrows, and sofas with casters being pushed along the sidewalk. It's strange what people save when in shock. One woman was carrying a bird cage, of which the bottom had fallen out somewhere along the line. Another man was carrying a parrot in a cage in one hand, a large demijohn, a bottle used to store liquids like wine or olive oil, in the other. Women were carrying ironing boards and irons, and one refugee got to safety only to find out that his precious bundle was firewood. Bedding, clothing, food, banjos, people grabbed whatever they could. Towards the end of day 3, the wind changed direction. The fire breaks finally became effective as the fire was chased back in the direction it had come from and, finding nothing left to burn, finally burned itself out. Soon after, rain started falling on the bedraggled remains of San Francisco. It was bad news for refugees camping in the city's parks, some without shelter. Clothes and bedding got soaked, and a cold wind didn't help the misery. However, the rain was also a blessing as it finally quenched the last of the smoldering embers in the city. When the dust finally settled and the smoke cleared, around 500 city blocks and 28,000 buildings were destroyed by the earthquake and fire around 4.5 square miles, leaving a desolate wasteland where once stood a city. Of the 450,000 people making up the population of San Francisco, around 200,000 were left homeless and around 3,000 had died. While the loss of life in the earthquake and fire is staggering, the number could have been much higher. If the earthquake and resulting fire had occurred 2 to 3 hours later, or even earlier, the number of dead could have been 6,000 or more. The commercial and industrial parts of town were deserted. The restaurants, saloons, and theaters were closed. Patrons and staff were at home. If the earthquake had hit during morning traffic or in the evening when the theaters, saloons, and streets were filled with people, the disaster would have been even more devastating. However, this was of small comfort to the survivors. While the military and civilian authorities worked around the clock, private companies also stepped up in San Francisco's time of need. The Southern Pacific and Santa Fe railroads closed their ticket offices immediately after the disaster and offered refugees free transport out of San Francisco. Around 100,000 refugees were handled out of the Oakland office alone, and the trains were so crowded, at least 3 engines were needed to get it moving. Thousands of refugees fled the city, and as many as 75,000 never returned. Those left behind faced weeks of hardship. When the fires were finally extinguished, not much of the city was left. The ruins of buildings were the only clues that it was once a great city. Next to piles of rubble, piano wire, and steel strands of sewing machines dragged out of damaged homes and into the street with hope of recovering these items later. They were all that remained of family homes. To prevent further fires, buildings that survived both the earthquake and the inferno had to be inspected. Damaged chimneys posed a risk and had to be cleared as safe by the chimney inspectors before they could be used. The lucky family would be issued a certificate that had to be displayed in a conspicuous place in front of the building. Since people weren't allowed to make fires in their kitchens, stoves were moved outside and cooking was done out in the middle of the street for many weeks to come. Within days of the earthquake, refugee camps were established in parks, on military reservations, and amidst the ruins of San Francisco. There were 26 official refugee camps around the city. 21 of these were managed by the army and considered the cleanest and safest. Early relief efforts were disorganized until Major General Adolphus Greeley stepped in, organizing the distribution of supplies. Food and water were strictly rationed, and rich and poor alike had to stand in long lines to get provisions. No one was allowed to sell anything. The military organized these camps into smaller tent towns, and the refugees quickly established routines. The children formed playgroups, and the dining halls and campfires replaced the upmarket restaurants and evenings at the opera for the rich, and the bars and bordellos for the working class. Unfortunately, no disaster is big enough to eradicate racism, and the Chinese residents were forced into a segregated camp in a remote area of the Presidio, farther away from the medical care of food supplies. Japanese and other Asian workers found themselves threatened by white workers complaining that Asians were taking their jobs at lower wages, thus lowering the wage scale. Some things apparently never change. Considering the poor living conditions of the thousands of homeless residents, an outbreak of disease was a serious concern. The San Francisco Board of Health appointed 500 physicians to form a group of sanitary inspectors who worked with the army to reduce the risk of disease that goes hand in hand with overcrowding, tainted water, and poor sanitation. To prevent outbreaks of disease like typhoid, sanitation inspectors investigated sanitation concerns and enforced the army's sanitation rules, which prevented an epidemic or even a significant increase in disease after the disaster. With rebuilding efforts underway, many of the refugees moved out of the camps as their homes were rebuilt, and the camps on the Presidio were dismantled and closed in mid-June, as most refugees had moved out by then. Conditions had improved so much by this time that the Field Hospital 1 was gradually closed down. In other camps, the tents were eventually replaced with small wooden earthquake cottages. Finally, in 1908, 2 years after the disaster, the last of the camps were disbanded and the cottages were moved to the owner's private property. After 2 months, the army turned over the responsibility of food distribution to the Red Cross and withdrew from San Francisco. Fearing that the disaster might impact the economy, California entrepreneurs and later the San Francisco Real Estate Board agreed to refer to the disaster as the Great Fire as opposed to the Great Earthquake, arguing that the fire did more damage than the earthquake, and the official death toll at the time was only 478. There was some concern that a more accurate death toll would dissuade people from returning and rebuilding. An earthquake is also considered an act of God that can't be prevented or prepared for, and therefore might discourage investors from investing money in San Francisco. A fire, on the other hand, is a threat that can be minimized with improved building codes and emergency plans. 2 days after the fire died, explosions once again rocked the city as buildings damaged beyond repair were demolished so that the rebuilding could begin again, and the city was rebuilt in record time. Many critics believed that it was rebuilt too quickly. As early as the Saturday morning following the fire, newspapers printed on the presses of the Oakland were already being sold. By Sunday, the first streetcar was up and running and 300 plumbers were already at work fixing sewers and water pipes. Within weeks, streetcars were running on Market Street, replacing the cable cars, and within 6 weeks, San Francisco's banks were once again open for business. The first couple of weeks after the disaster, any able-bodied citizen who happened to be in the vicinity were drafted into clearing the rubble off the streets. With industries destroyed, there were many an able-bodied citizen that found themselves temporarily unemployed. However, before the end of April, professionals took over the task of clearing and rebuilding San Francisco. Thousands of tons of rubble of what was once a city were dumped in Mission Bay and off the cliffs near Land's End. Some claimed that around 15,000 horses were worked to death in San Francisco months after the disaster. From the ashes of a gold rush boomtown rose a modern, cleaner San Francisco, complete with steel-framed buildings to replace the wooden structures, documented every step of the way by photographers and artists, many of whom lost their studios, and with it, their life's work. The city fathers hoped to use the opportunity to relocate Chinatown. Before the fire, Chinatown was a crowded slum rife with disease, brothels, and opium. However, it occupied one of the best locations in the city, making it prime real estate, something the city fathers were quite keen to get their hands on. There were talks of relocating Chinatown to the mudflats on the southern outskirts of the city, to Hunter's Point, or pretty much any location on the fringes of the new San Francisco. However, the Chinese government and local community threatened a trade boycott should this happen, so in the end, Chinatown was rebuilt exactly where it had been before. The earthquake and fire had one upside for the Chinese community. With birth records and immigration paperwork destroyed, many could claim to be American citizens, which allowed them to finally bring their families to America, something they were unable to do before. The state offices were new, those using them were not. It didn't take long for corruption to rear its ugly head as the mayor and some associates were once again looking for under-the-table payments for city services or licenses. After a lengthy investigation and 250 indictments, the mayor and the board of supervisors were all removed from office in 1907. By 1912, a new city hall had been built with a dome higher than the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and by 1915, San Francisco was back, bigger and better than ever before, when it proudly hosted the 1915 World's Fair, the Panama Pacific International Exposition. The exposition not only celebrated the opening of the Panama Canal, but also showcased the newly rebuilt San Francisco to the rest of the world. The earthquake that shook San Francisco on that fateful day in April 1906 is still considered one of the most significant earthquakes of all time. Even though thousands died and even more were left homeless, the size of the earthquake provided scientists and seismologists with a wealth of information, leading to great breakthroughs in the world of earthquake research. Shortly after the earthquake, Governor George C. Pardee appointed a state earthquake investigation commission under Professor Andrew C. Lawson, chairman of the geology department at the University of California, Berkeley. The commission's final report, today known as the Lawson Report, was published in 1908, 2 years after the disaster, and is still considered an authoritative work on earthquakes and possibly the most important study of a single earthquake. Valuable lessons were learned in the 1906 earthquake. A shift was made to more robust buildings resilient to shaking and more fireproof. Advancements were also made in creating and implementing early warning systems to warn people that an earthquake would hit. Over 100 years later, California, Oregon, and Washington have the Shake Alert earthquake early warning system that has its roots in the Great Earthquake and Fire of 1906. The earthquake of 1906 wasn't the first to hit San Francisco, and it wouldn't be the last, but it would certainly be the worst. However, the people of San Francisco saw it as a challenge, and they rose to the occasion. One businessman lost 3 businesses, one a 5-story warehouse selling phonographs and musical instruments. After the fire, he went into real estate and appears to have been quite successful. Homes and businesses were rebuilt, schools reopened, and people continued on with their lives. There's a good reason the flag of San Francisco depicts a phoenix rising from the ashes. Today, over 700,000 people call San Francisco their home. Improved building codes, disaster awareness plans, and early warning systems have gone a long way to make the city safer. However, at the end of the day, despite years of earthquake research, it's still impossible to accurately predict when and where an earthquake will hit. Research is ongoing, but beneath the bustling streets of San Francisco, the San Andreas Fault slowly grinds away, preparing for the next big one, difficult to predict and impossible to prevent.